Boa noite. Estamos começando. Muito obrigado. Estamos aqui na nossa primeira noite da Flip 2015, com um encontro que eu já sei que vai ser memorável, com o Colm Tóibín, que já esteve aqui na Flip e volta em grande estilo para conversar com o Ángel. Por favor, eu gostaria que vocês entrassem. Colm e Ángel Gurria Quintana, que é jornalista mexicano, do Financial Times, autor da coletânea de literatura brasileira Other Carnivals. Colm, Ángel, venham. É isso aí, Ángel, a palavra é sua. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Está ligado? Está funcionando? Dá para ouvir? Ok. Não. Está melhor?
Mine's working.
Esse funciona? Se não, podemos pegar outro microfone.
Tudo bem? Precisa de um outro microfone?
You want to try this?
Acho que... let's try this. Está melhor assim?
Turn it on.
No?
Turn it on.
That would help. Hang on. Preciso de ajuda aqui.
Tem esse aqui, ó. Pega esse aqui.
Ótimo. Obrigado, Paulo. Está melhor assim? Boa noite a todo mundo. E bem-vindos a esta mesa 4 da Flip 2015, onde tenho o enorme prazer de assistir, de participar de um encontro com Colm Tóibín. Quem assistiu a Flip no ano 2004, a segunda Flip, talvez lembre ao Colm numa magnífica palestra sobre James Joyce, Ulisses do James Joyce. Talvez lembre um momento inesquecível quando o Colm começou a jogar sabões para a galera. Sweeney's Lemon Soap. Então, bom, é muito bom ter ele aqui de volta. Colm é o grande romancista irlandês contemporâneo. É autor de 10 livros de ficção e vários livros de reportagem, ensaio, crônica de viagem e crítica literária. Foi indicado para o prêmio Booker por romances como A Luz do Farol, Blackwater Lightship, O Mestre, Brooklyn, e O Testamento de Maria, todos publicados no Brasil pela Companhia das Letras. The Master, O Mestre, mereceu o Impact Dublin Literature Award no ano 2006, um dos maiores prêmios literários. Ele é hoje o Silverman Professor of the Humanities na Universidade de Columbia, em Nova York. Hoje conversaremos sobre 2 livros do Colm, os livros mais recentes dele. Nora Webster, um magnífico romance publicado aqui pela Companhia das Letras, e um outro livro, um lindo ensaio chamado On Elizabeth Bishop, sobre Elizabeth Bishop, que ainda não foi publicado no Brasil. Então, welcome, Colm.
Thank you very much.
So no soap this time.
No soap. We're all clean.
Colm, let's start talking about Nora Webster, which is being launched here in Brazil. It's connected to an earlier novel of yours, Brooklyn. And the protagonist of Brooklyn is mentioned almost in passing in the first pages of Nora Webster. So could you tell us about how Nora Webster came about and what its connection is to some of your earlier books?
Well, they're all set, the Blackwater Lightship, Nora Webster and Brooklyn are set in the small town of Enniscorthy in the southeast of Ireland, which is the town where I'm from. And it's almost as though I do one novel in the town and then I find another subject, such as Henry James or such as the Virgin Mary, before going back to the town for the other book. In the year 2000, I began 2 books in the spring of 2000. One was the first chapter of Nora Webster, and the other was the first chapter of The Master. And oddly enough, even though The Master required research, it was about Henry James, it involved a great deal of reading and thinking about his life. it was easier to continue with that book and leave the other book, Nora Webster. The problem I had with Nora Webster was that some of the material was so personal, it was so detailed about what happened in my house after my father died when I was 12, what happened to my mother, that it was a question of two things. One, wondering if I could use this material that belonged to other people as well as me, and that was actually autobiographical, but it was other people's biographies besides mine. That was the first question. The second question was how to put shape on that material, because it really was very close to life, and it didn't have what fiction needs, is a lift, an arc, a way up and a way over and out. So I needed a lot of time, and I mean, it took me almost 14 years to work that out in full. What happened in the meantime was that I went to America to teach, and I was teaching in Texas. And I don't know if there's anyone here from Texas, but I hope not. But I've nothing against Texas, but it will be lovely when they finish it. You know, it has a strange, unfinished feel to it. And what happened there was, it's also very far from the sea. I mean, at least Austin was very far from the sea. And it was all flat and strange. And I began to miss home. I began to miss things I don't even like when I'm home, like, you know, Irish bread or Irish radio or Irish television or Irish news. And so I began to miss home. I began to count the days. I began to think, I wish I was home now. I lay in bed in the morning. And so when I just lay in bed in the morning, literally feeling homesick. So when I came home, I read the first chapter of Nora Webster again, and I saw in the first chapter the story of Brooklyn in about 3 lines. And so that I stopped working on Nora Webster, and I went to Brooklyn, and I worked on Brooklyn. And when Brooklyn came out, I was doing an event like this in New York, and I was signing a book for a woman, and she said to me, I think this book is about my mother. And I said, oh, did your mother marry an Italian? And she was Irish. And she said, no. I think this book is literally about my mother, and my sister thinks that too. And I said, what was your mother's name? And she gave me a name. And I said, oh, that's your mother. Your grandmother came to our house when I was 12, and she had all letters from Brooklyn and talk about conversations about people in Brooklyn. And I listened to every word she said. But when she left the house, people told the story in our house of her daughter who had gone to Brooklyn, who had come home, who had told them she wasn't married. So the whole story of Brooklyn came from what I heard in the house when I was 12.
Mm. You and I had a conversation once, and you were talking about Saul Bellow, the American writer, and how disappointed you were to find that some of the best bits in Saul Bellow's novel like Herzog, for instance, was taken from his own life. So it wasn't fiction, it was sort of taken from memory. And you expressed outrage. Now, a novel like Nora Webster really follows very closely the contours of your own life. So how do you negotiate that sort of fiction and autobiography?
Well, I mean, the Saul Bellow issue was that Herzog goes home one evening, he's separated from his wife, and he goes home stealthily, and he looks in the back window, and there's a man with one leg bathing his daughter. And I thought this was impossible. This was fiction. Only to find the biography said, yes, Saul Bellow went home one evening, went around the back window, found a one-legged man bathing his daughter. And I think writers do use, some writers, and perhaps most writers, at some point in their lives, use the smallest details of what happened. And there are many reasons for this. The first one is laziness. I mean, if you're looking for a room, and you want a room in your novel, it's much easier to use your grandmother's room, or a room that you know, rather than a room you imagine. But other times you imagine the room. And the mischief you do, in a way, is by mixing fact and fiction, by actually getting the two and merging them. So that for example, in Nora Webster, sometimes the tiniest detail. My mother went to Dublin, and she bought a record of Jacqueline du Pré and Barenboim playing Beethoven's Archduke Trio, and she played it over and over, and that's in the book. I needed her to buy something in Dublin that would lift her spirits, but also darken them. Music that was both inspiring and in some way or other frightening. And that music did the job for me, but it wasn't invented. It was exactly that record. And so throughout Nora Webster, I used those details. Obviously, when it came to something like the Testament of Mary, which is about the Virgin Mary, obviously that's not autobiographical. I was not involved in that particular situation, in the same way as I was involved. So that, in some books you need it. Some books don't do it. Like, don't try it in other books.
And Nora Webster, you go sort of quite deeply into the autobiographical. One of the sons of Nora Webster lives, well, the children live through situations very much like ones you lived through. They're left in care with an aunt. One of them develops a stammer.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are descriptions of novelists where someone on whom nothing is lost, or someone who's a great noticer. And certainly in those years, when I was about 12, I began to notice everything. And I frightened the adults quite a lot by remembering everything I noticed. So if a woman came to the house and spoke, a year later, I would be able to say exactly what she said. It's a nightmare for a family to have a noticer in the room. But it's very useful for a novelist later on because you can summon up this material very, very easily. And also, the most interesting thing was when they talked about other people. And they talked about other people a lot. And you could find out all sorts of things, but eventually they would notice me and put me out. But until then, I was gathering and gathering and gathering a lifetime's information, which I could use in novels.
Nora Webster is very much about grief. She's recently widowed at the beginning of the book, but also very much about how that grief affects other people and other people's expectations of her. Other people seem to kind of have a right to tell her what she should do, how she should live her life.
I think the novel is caught between two moments in time. One is where Ireland was a deeply Catholic country and death was part of nature almost, fully accepted by people, and later a world full of psychiatrists, counselors, grief counselors, books on how to cope with grief. And I'm capturing about 10 years in the middle, where the first thing was almost faded, where death is something natural and acceptable, and everybody was going to heaven after death. And 10 years later, where all this help was available. In this decade, I'm talking about the years from about 1967 to 72, in these 5 years, nothing was available. And what's happened to Nora Webster simply is her anchor is gone, meaning her partner. So she has no idea how to live, who she is, and people see that as a sort of vacuum that they can fill. So they all have ideas about what she should do, where she should go, what she should be wearing, what she should be buying. And she herself is emptied almost. She's almost as though the novel is slowly filling her with how she must live now. The changes are imperceptible. I didn't want to give her one grand moment where the grief lifts from her, instead of gradually building, as you might build grades in color, or as you might lift melody in music, to give her a sort of new life, but one that she doesn't really even know that she's getting.
I wonder if this is a good moment for you to read from Nora Webster.
Well, you see, one of the problems I had with the book was that it's set in the 1960s. And when you say the 1960s, you think of the Beatles, the miniskirt, contraception, loads of sex, rock and roll, drugs. Well, there were no drugs in my town, I can tell you. There were some cigarettes, and there was quite a lot of alcohol, but there were no drugs, and there was really no rock and roll either. And there must have been sex, but I never saw any of it, and it happened indoors. Indoors, perhaps late at night, when nobody was looking. So I was trying to think of one thing that happened that did really change everything. And this thing that I thought of was that cheap hair dye arrived in the town, and every woman in the town got her hair dyed in a given year. I would think the year was about 1967. Every woman who had grey hair got blonde hair, blue hair, black hair. And it was unbelievable. It was like the autumn coming, and all the trees just changing their color overnight. Anyway, this is Nora's version of that story. I mean, she's about 48. This is about 1968. On Wednesday morning, she went downtown and had her hair done, talking to Bernie and the hairdressers about a new system of dyeing hair she'd read about, wondering if it was time that she did something about the grey. "I wouldn't like it blue," she said. "I know what you mean," Bernie replied. "And if it was too black, then it would look dyed," Nora said. "And I was never blonde. Everyone in the town knows I was never blonde. Is there a good brown so it might not look dyed? I could try this one." Bernie showed her a package with a photograph of a woman with curly brown hair that looked natural. "Maybe just start off with a small bit," she said. "The instructions say to use the whole thing. I've used it before. It's very popular. You'd be surprised who has it." "Well, try it so," Nora said. Once the dye had been applied, Bernie put a nylon net on her head and left her to flick through some magazines. When she saw that she would not be home in time to cook a proper dinner for the boys, she regretted having come here at all, and she knew that she would have to go soon. She signaled to Bernie, who was now busy with two women who'd come in together and appeared to need to consult each other about each clip of the scissors. "I'll be right with you," Bernie said. When she came over to remove the net, Bernie told her not to worry or look too closely, as the real change would come only once the dryer and a brush and comb were used. Nora was aware that the two women Bernie had been looking after were studying her closely. Nora wondered if she should not have consulted other women before getting her hair dyed for the first time, but she couldn't think of anyone she could have asked. Both of her sisters, she presumed, dyed their hair, but she'd never heard them talking about it. Slowly, as she watched Bernie working with the hairdryer, she realized that she was being given the hairstyle of a much younger woman, and that the women watching it all happen knew that and were taking it in with considerable satisfaction. The more Bernie worked, the more Nora's hair seemed to look like a wig. She knew that the dye would take time to wash out, but in the mirror, she could see how pleased Bernie was with her own work. There would be no point in complaining. "Is it not a bit young for me?" she asked. "I think you look great," Bernie replied. "The cut is very fashionable at the moment." "Oh, I've never had a fashionable cut before," she said. When it was finished, she knew that anyone who saw her on the way home would think that she had lost her mind, or that she was trying to look like a young woman rather than someone who was recently widowed. "It'll take a few days to get used to," Bernie said, "but no one has grey hair anymore." "Does the dye not look very unnatural?" Nora asked. "In a few days it will lose that look, and people will think that you've had it all your life. You look very worried, but I promise you that by the weekend you'll be delighted with it. You can't wash it out, can you?" "No, but it will fade, and I guarantee you that you'll be back in a month for the same again. I've never known anyone to go back to the grey. But maybe the next time we'll think of putting some highlights in. They're all the rage now as well." "Highlights? Oh, I don't think so." Outside, she lifted her head high and hoped that all the women in Court Street and John Street would be busy cooking, and that none of them would be standing at the door. She prayed that she would meet no one she knew. In her mind, she went through the worst possible encounters, the people who would most deplore the idea that with her husband 6 months in the grave, she had dyed her hair a colour it had never been before. She thought of Jim, her brother-in-law, and she would have to face him within a week. He would not know what to think. As she saw Mrs. Hogan from John Street walking towards her, Nora could not tell whether Mrs. Hogan simply did not recognize her or if she wanted to get by her without making any comment. Just as Mrs. Hogan approached her, she seemed almost to jump. Her face quivered and then she stopped. "Well, that will take some getting used to," she said. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Colm. Before we continue, I've just been asked to remind everyone to please turn off their mobile phones. Colm isn't expecting any calls for the next half hour or so it's okay. We can turn them off. Thank you very much for that, for reading from that passage. There are a couple of things that strike me. One is dialogue and your ear for dialogue, and it runs throughout the book. It's based on sort of fantastic conversations between the characters. where it's not so much what they say as what they're withholding.
Yes, you know, I think the novel form is very interesting in this respect, and it's the only form we have where we can see what a character is thinking. We can go through their response to everything. We can see what they're feeling. We can see what they're remembering. And then we can see what they're saying. And we can see that that may be very different to the things that went before. In drama, you really can't do that. You can suggest it. An actor can work with it. But you can't have it as clear and as well dramatized, that division between what's going on in my mind and what I'm actually letting you know. And that, therefore, becomes a very interesting weapon in a novel. It's a very dramatic form to have somebody not saying what they're thinking. So the reader enters a conspiracy with the character over silence, over withholding, over what's not being said. And that can be very powerful.
Nora Webster in particular, we get a sense of the things being sort of not said.
Yes, she's filled with various forms of concealment. I mean, the problem is, what do you do in a house where your husband, who was there just a month before, isn't there now? You can't talk about him all the time. You may be thinking about him all the time, but you must change the subject. And therefore, the reader can see slowly her attempting to construct an almost fictional universe around things she says she's interested in, that she's really not. But she can't bring up the subject, the big subject, all the time. And so the reader starts slowly to follow her as she conceals much more than she discloses by everything she says and does.
The other thing which comes across in that passage is also, you sort of document the period. There's a bit of social history there. And there are some things that happen in the period of the novel, some sort of momentous things. It's the beginning of the Irish Troubles, a man lands on the moon. All these things are happening, but we only hear about them sort of tangentially.
Yeah, there's a wonderful moment in Stendhal's novel, The Charterhouse of Parma, where Fabrice, who's the protagonist, he's a complete fool, and he's always in love, and love is not working for him. But he's somewhere up in the north of Europe, and there's a lot of noise, and there are horses coming and going, and injured people. But he's thinking about his girlfriend. It's only later he realizes that he was at the Battle of Waterloo. He was at it. He saw it. But of course he was thinking about love, thinking about a girl, so he sort of missed the battle while being at it at the same time. And if you're a novelist, you have to choose in a way between, you know, the novel is set in the very years when the trouble in Northern Ireland begins, when the killings begin, when the IRA begins the campaign, when the British Army comes in, and all that's going on all the time. You know, it begins in 68, certainly by the end of the novel in 72, it's very intense. And I had to make a decision whether to trust the idea that you could set a novel and focus a novel on a powerless woman in a small town and make her the center of attention. And what I thought about more than anything else were those portraits by, say, Vermeer or Rembrandt of somebody ordinary in a kitchen or a sitting room, or just somebody ordinary whose face is painted with such careful detail. They're given importance by the painter. You look at their face and think you know them. And I thought I would follow that and put the other material, the moon landing and the troubles in Northern Ireland, in the background just to anchor the novel in a certain time, but not let them come into the forefront of the book.
When we look back at your fiction, some of the characters that stand out, Nora Webster, Eilis Lacey, Mary, Helen in Blackwater Lightship, are all women, very complex and convincingly complex women. What draws you to these female characters?
I suppose the first thing is that my mother was a woman, you know, and she had two younger sisters who didn't marry until later, and they were always in the house. And my father had a sister, an older sister, and she was always in the house, and they were always talking. Now, sometimes they would just talk about clothes, or they gossip about neighbors, but it was always interesting, the conversation. Whereas sometimes when men were in the room, I don't know if this happens here, where women do a lot of interesting talk, and a man could just come into the house and say, that goal on Sunday was a good goal. And the other man would say, yes, but the second goal was a good goal as well. I'd say, yes, it was. And they might say nothing else at all. And, but Samuel Beckett is a social realist. In other words, this idea of men repeating themselves, talking about nothing, saying nothing, the other man saying nothing. And I have attempted to deal with this, especially in an early novel called The Heather Blazing, and in the novel about Henry James, where Henry James generally says nothing. But it requires a lot of work. You're in a man's head, and he really wants to say nothing. And no matter what happens, he says nothing. And you're trying to get a novel out of him. Come on, say something. And, whereas with the women characters, for example, with Mary in the Testament of Mary, it's 20 years after the crucifixion. She's old. She doesn't care anymore, but she's never, ever spoken about these things before. She's never described the crucifixion before. And one night, when the house is empty, she decides for once, I'm going to say everything that happened. My job is to make this seem credible. For example, there's a moment when she's running, when she's trying to find Jesus. And it's not the prospect of the crucifixion that she's worried about. It's her shoe. Her shoe is really hurting her. And she has to go very fast. And those details sometimes matter more than the big questions of redemption, eternal life. In fact, when she hears about eternal life, she's very suspicious of it. At least in my book she is. So it's a question then of using voice. And for example, in Nora Webster, yes, using dialogue not only to not only to conceal and not disclose, but to in a certain way disclose personality by the dialogue having a sort of flavor, not being dead dialogue, having a sort of vigor or a spice in the tone of the line that will not only be regionally accurate, how people spoke in that place at that time, but will have a sort of poetry to it, even if it's a sour underground poetry.
You mentioned the master, and you said once that you tried to write this novel about Henry James almost as a thought experiment. You wanted a protagonist whose father had not died, which happens in many of your novels, including Nora Webster.
Yeah, there was a woman in Australia was getting a book signed. It was a new novel, and she looked at me, and a very sad look came on her face. How many people die in this book, she said. I felt really sorry for her. I said, I'd love to write a book in which nobody dies, And in the Henry James book, there are elements in it that are autobiographical, in that he is the second son in a family of 5. And if anyone here, knows where you come in the family is so important. And if you're the second son and your older brother is really athletic, he's always knocking down fences, and you're this little wimp in the kitchen, afraid of everything, that stays with you all your life. And that was the relationship between Henry James and William, that Henry James was afraid of his older brother until his older brother died, when they were both in their 60s. And yes, but also the father and mother, that he did come from an intact household, and he did try and navigate that. And I was interested for once in not having a dead parent in the book. I did kill them off eventually. But as the book, as his childhood develops, his parents are both there.
Speaking of killing parents, one of my favorite titles from your books is your book of essays, New Ways to Kill Your Mother, which is sort of about writers and their families.
Yeah, there's always an element of a writer in a family being a sort of traitor. What I was talking about earlier, the idea of stealing stories, of using your siblings, that the story of your parents belongs to everybody, but the writer is the one who uses it. But I also think there is always a fear in a family of a writer that somehow or other you're going to be imprisoned, or you're going to be found out, or you're somehow or other, it's not a proper job like being an engineer, or a doctor, or even a priest. It's somehow or other fraudulent, making up these stories and publishing them. So that mothers worry about this. I can tell you that as a fact.
Thank you, Colm. I'd like to move now, if I may, to your wonderful essay on Elizabeth Bishop. You've said in the book you discovered her when you were about 19 years old. Tell us a little bit about that discovery.
Well, she lived very much, I mean, especially when she was in Brazil, in her years in Brazil, in the shadow of a number of poets, such as Robert Lowell or John Berryman in North America or Randall Jarrell. And slowly, by dint of working very slowly, by making everything she did perfect, by working for years and years on a poem until everything in the poem was right, by putting the correct level of feeling into a poem, the matter of feeling interested her very deeply, because she felt if you put too much feeling into a poem, you would almost lose the reader. But if you put too little feeling in and conceal the feeling in between lines and gave the reader a sense of feeling in the rhythm, you would get much more from the poem. And she worked slowly in this determined way of hers for all these years until now. She's a much better known poet. She's probably the most studied poet of the second half of the 20th century and the most read and the most loved in English, who comes from America. And so I was particularly interested in this idea that her father died when she was 6 months old. Her mother was incarcerated in a mental hospital when she was 5. And she didn't write a direct poem about this. Yes, she wrote a poem called The Art of Losing. Yes, she referred to loss, but it isn't there in the poems. What she did was she looked outwards rather than inwards. And in her ways of noticing landscapes, seascapes, mountainscapes, people, in her way of observing the world, she managed to suggest how easy, how fragile a thing the world is, and people and things. And the poems are filled with noticing, because if you don't notice enough, the thing might fade. And so what she did was she implied a great deal in the poems. The poems are filled with implication. But she was really concerned with the matter which she described as when emotion is greater than its cause. She was really against that. She thought emotion should be contained, and if necessary, description of emotion withheld. But withheld so that something much more interesting could be released. A great ambiguous pain is released in her poems, even in poems where pain is not mentioned, or particularly where it's not mentioned. The energy around pain and loss is released and given to the reader in some shivering, strange way coming from the side of the poem. And that is her genius, and that is why, in a way, she's such a loved poet and such an interesting poet to write about. This book, I mean, the only problem I had with this book was I desperately didn't want to finish it. I delivered it 2 years late because I just wanted to keep going back to the poems, noticing one more thing, adding one more thing. But eventually I had to hand it over, and so it's out now.
I'm fascinated by your observation of her poetry, that she concentrates on this idea of sort of not much, the idea of nothing or not much, and how much that can do. Because it seems to me to be a key to your own writing as well.
Yes, I'm interested in that sort of minimalism of trying to just write down the sentence and trying to keep flourishes out. In other words, adjectives are often not needed. And if you just go through a book, I mean a well-known book, and just take out all the adjectives, it would often be a better book. I mean, and with Bishop, what's also fascinating about Bishop, of course, is that that her arrival in Brazil gives her poetics an entire new energy. And this is something, I mean, anyone who comes from a northern country, I mean, I came when I was 20 from Dublin to Barcelona, and just the idea of colour, of food, of the whole way the street works, of the way people look and the way people express themselves, I sort of understood what that might be like for somebody who came from Nova Scotia originally. So that when, I mean, she said she thought she had woken up, you know, and she'd woke up in a paradise, you know, that she'd gone to heaven when she finally found herself in Rio and then in the country house in Petropolis. And she had, I suppose, about 14 or 15 years of great, great happiness in Brazil from the age of about 40 to the age of about 55. She was in love, and she was in love with Brazil and with Brazilian culture of every type as well. It was, in a way, she was escaping further from herself into something that she saw as exotic and purely colourful. And she wrote about that. And she also, of course, when it was over, when the big festival was over of her love for Lota, and when she went back and found herself living in Boston, And I've nothing against Boston either. I mean, I don't hope there's no one here from Boston. But the snow in Boston this year was 10 feet high. People couldn't get out of their houses. I mean, it's not a place to live. And she ended up there in Boston. Of course, it killed her. You know.
And this is connected again to your what you said earlier about sort of your close relationship with silence. This is what you identify in her writing.
Yeah, I found in the early poems of Bishop, without knowing anything about her biography, without knowing who she lost or where she came from, I found some tone in the poems that spoke to me. And what it spoke to me of was some melancholy that was not named in the poem, but was implied all the time in the poem's diction. And I became interested in, if you could do that in prose, what it would look like. If you could take that idea and put it into a paragraph in which someone, say, is listening to music, and there's no mention of their pain or of loss, but somehow or other, in the way you've composed the sentences, in the way you've put in the semicolon, or a word you've used, or a word you've left out, you can get that level of feeling without having to seem to work for it.
You've said elsewhere that some of the poets that you most admired, people like Tom Gunn, Elizabeth Bishop, writers like James Baldwin, you thought you were originally interested in them because they were homosexual. And you found that that wasn't the thing, really, that was most interesting.
Yeah. I mean, when I was about 18 or 19, I wasn't actively looking for homosexual role models. But if I thought somebody was gay, I wonder how they had lived, had they written about it, when had they written about it. I think the great example is the African-American writer James Baldwin, a first novel that I absolutely, recognize every moment of, called Go Tell It on the Mountain, which is, of course, about his religious childhood and about being from a religious family in Harlem, a close religious family. And when he'd written that novel and was about to become the spokesman for Black America, coming out of religious America, he wrote a novel called Giovanni's Room, which has no black people, is set in Paris, and they're all gay. You can just imagine his mother, I mean, not to speak of his publisher. Everybody went nuts. But I love the way Baldwin would move from one of his worlds to another, and then in a novel like Another Country, tried to connect them. And similarly, a figure like Thomas Mann, writing openly about homosexuality and death in Venice, and then trying to cover his tracks in other novels. And I was just interested in how they were all managing this. And but what they all had happened to each one of them was they all had lost a parent in childhood. And in the end, I came to feel that had mattered more for the way in which they composed their sentences, or the way in which they wrote their books, or the way in which they lived their lives, than the matter of homosexuality, which seemed to me almost a smaller thing in identity, in the forming of an identity, than the loss of a parent, which seemed to me a very strange idea that I hadn't come across before, but now I began to feel very deeply and think to be true.
Mm. Let's go back to Elizabeth Bishop, and I'd like to ask the audience, of course, to start sending in any questions they have. But I thought it would be wonderful to hear, in your voice and in your accent, one of Elizabeth Bishop's Brazilian poets. So could you read for us Santarém?
This is the poem Santarém. What we have to remember is that this is a poem of loss, that she's lost Brazil by this time. She's back in the Boston I described, the snowy Boston, and she realizes it's all over. The great adventure is gone, and she's remembering a journey she took. Just notice how little metaphor is here. Notice how few similes are here. Notice how she corrects herself twice. She's really good at correcting herself. If something is not exact, she calls it a church and then has to say, no, a cathedral. Rather, it was a cathedral. And notice how she uses plain description of things she's looking at. And out of that plain description, something much larger arises or emerges. This is Santarém. Of course, I may be remembering it all wrong after how many years? That golden evening, I really wanted to go no further. More than anything else, I wanted to stay a while in that conflux of two great rivers, Tapajós, Amazon, grandly, silently flowing east. Suddenly, there'd been houses, people, and lots of mongrel riverboats skittering back and forth under a sky of gorgeous underlit clouds, with everything gilded, burnished along one side, and everything bright, cheerful, casual, or so it looked. I liked the place. I liked the idea of the place. 2 rivers. Hadn't 2 rivers sprung from the Garden of Eden? No, that was 4, and they diverged. Here only 2, and coming together. Even if one were tempted to literary interpretations such as life, death, right, wrong, male, female, such notions would have dissolved straight off in that watery, dazzling dialectic. In front of the church, the cathedral rather, there was a modest promenade and a belvedere about to fall into the river. Stubby palms, flamboyance like pans of embers, building 1 story high, stucco blue or yellow, and one house faced with azulejos, buttercup yellow. The street was deep in dark gold river sand, damp from the ritual afternoon rain, and teams of zebus plodded gentle, proud and blue, with down-curved horns and hanging ears, pulling carts with solid wheels. The zebus' hooves, the people's feet, waded in golden sand, dampened by golden sand, so that almost the only sounds were creaks and shh. 2 rivers full of crazy shipping, people all apparently changing their minds, embarking, disembarking, rowing clumsy dories. After the Civil War, some southern families came here. Here they could still own slaves. They left occasional blue eyes, English names, and oars. No other place, no one on all the Amazon's 4,000 miles does anything but paddle. A dozen or so young nuns, white-habited, waved gaily from an old stern wheeler, getting up steam already hung with hammocks, off to their mission, days and days away, up God knows what lost tributary. Side wheelers, countless wobbling dugouts. A cow stood up in one, quite calm, chewing her cud while being ferried, tipping, wobbling somewhere to be married. A river schooner with raked masts and violet-coloured sails tacked so close, her bowsprit seemed to touch the church, cathedral, rather. A week or so before, there'd been a thunderstorm, and the cathedral had been struck by lightning. One tower had a widening zigzag crack all the way down. It was a miracle. The priest's house right next door had been struck too, and his brass bed, the only one in town, galvanized black. Gracias a Deus, he'd been in Belém. In the blue pharmacy, the pharmacist had hung an empty wasp's nest from a shelf, small, exquisite, clean matte white, and hard as stucco. I admired it so much he gave it to me. Then my ship's whistle blew. I couldn't stay. Back on board, a fellow passenger, Mr. Swan, Dutch, the retiring head of Philips Electric, really a very nice old man, who wanted to see the Amazon before he died, asked, "What's that ugly thing?" That's a great one.
Thank you, Colm. And I think the translation people might have been hearing into Portuguese was by Paulo Henriques Brito, so thank you to him. You wrote poetry yourself in the early years.
Yeah, I'm a failed poet. I mean, it's a real problem if you're Irish and you write poetry, because we don't have Hollywood, we don't have Wall Street. You know, we don't even have many people. It's a small country. We don't have anything really at the moment as well, because our economy just went bust. But we do have poets. And one thing, if you're a bad poet, people really despise you. And it really wouldn't help being. So I stopped young, luckily. But I was encouraged to stop. But I always felt the lack of it. I mean, it's something I miss.
I'd like to pick up on a line you use about Elizabeth Bishop, which is it comes through in Santarém. And it reminds me also a great deal about your own work, or your own trajectory. You said about Elizabeth Bishop, no matter where she was, she thought of elsewhere.
Yes, there's an extraordinary letter from Bishop where she writes to Robert Lowell, and she's really having the most wonderful time in Brazil. And I mean, it's, everything is going really well. And she just says, I would give it all for one day to see the fall colors in Nova Scotia. And that was, she came in a line north-south, and there are letters over and over from Brazil about Nova Scotia. But then, of course, when she got back to Boston, she wrote about Brazil. And those poems written about Nova Scotia, the best ones, are always written when she's away from Nova Scotia. And that idea of place, and that idea of coming from a small place, as she did, as I do, she came from a small village in Nova Scotia with the sea very nearby. And I come from Ireland in a similar way, from a small town with the sea very nearby. It marks you. You get to know, if you're a novelist, a community of people. You can go back to them over and over, small things they did and said, stories about them, things you remember about them. But outside of that is a thing called the wide world. And the wide world is very interesting. So that you find yourself in Barcelona, and it could be that beautiful, say, month of May, when the weather is beautiful, you can start swimming. And just one moment you're in the Mediterranean and you're swimming, and that evening you're going to have this wonderful dinner, and everything is perfect, and you just think, I'd like to be in the Irish Sea. The Irish Sea is really cold. And when you get into it first, it's awful. But when you're in it, when you're used to it, it's really better than the Mediterranean. And for 1 second, you have a feeling, I should be at home. But then when you go home, you think, I'd give anything tonight to be in Barcelona. I really would love to have a really great dinner in a certain restaurant, Irish food. You go through that all your life, really. You never settle. Sometimes, for a while, I was lucky enough in New York to have an apartment that overlooked the Hudson River. And it came into my head all the time that if I could get out into the river and get a proper boat, I could go home, Ireland. Just, forget JFK, the airport, and just get into a boat and just slowly stretch out and go across the Atlantic and come up the harbour into Wexford and say, hi, I'm back. And that actually became a constant thought until it became a wish. But it wasn't always a wish. So that idea of home, not home, dissatisfaction. Bishop has a wonderful ending to a poem where she says, is it lack of it's a poem called Questions of Travel, and it's one of her Brazil poems, and she says at the end, is it lack of imagination makes us come to imagined places, or not just stay at home? Or could Pascal have been entirely right about sitting quietly in one's room? Country, city, something society. The choice is never wide and never free, and here or there should we have stayed at home, wherever that may be. So, she began, she wrote that, she began to interest me as a poet not only of exile, but a poet of constant melancholy missing of the previous place where she'd been.
And when you write, do you find you need to be away from Wexford and Enniscorthy to write about those places?
I don't think it's as easy as that. You see, I think that you live in your memory and you live in your head, and what you want more than anything is a blank wall. You're facing a blank wall, you've got a pen and a notebook, and you're writing. But where you've got what you're also doing is you're forgetting that you yourself exist. The page is not a mirror, the page is blank. So you're actually attempting to make a world. So it doesn't really matter where you are because you're so involved in forgetting yourself. But what you do need is a blank wall. Looking at trying to write while looking at a window at a beautiful view might help your soul, but it wouldn't help your prose style.
Indeed. We have the first questions coming in, and I just want to ask one thing, and I know we shouldn't trust everything we read on Wikipedia, but
what's coming?
But Colm Tóibín's entry says that in order to write, you sit on a hard, uncomfortable chair which causes you pain.
Yeah. I think the idea of writing as a form of pleasure. Oh, I'm going into a write. It's going to be a great day. This is hard stuff. You're dragging stuff up from parts of yourself that are hidden or private, and necessarily so. And you're trying to make metaphors of them, or you're trying to write them down exactly as they were. And your job is to concentrate. Now, comfort is a really bad idea. You should not be comfortable. So you should not eat too much, for example. Drinking doesn't help. Drugs are a disaster. But a soft, those soft chairs they're making now, the master of the universe office chairs, where you can turn around and give your instructions to everybody. Those ones anyway, I'm against those chairs. And I think a good narrow wooden chair is much better for a sentence.
Excellent. Free advice to all the writers.
Thank you.
So we have some of the questions coming in already. This one goes back to something you were talking about earlier on. Is it easy for you to write from a woman's perspective? Does it come naturally, or does it demand a lot of mental work?
I mean, I think that you have to be careful, that every writer should be able to do anything. I mean, Flaubert was able to write Madame Bovary, but, I wouldn't like to... I don't think when you're writing, you're necessarily got any particular gender. In other words, you're almost not there, and you're trying to imagine the world from somebody else's position. But it's a difficult one because there are things about women's experience that I couldn't possibly know. And a few times I have tried to ask a woman a very intimate question, to be told something that was either funny or just wrong. I mean, women are very secretive about themselves, so I can't really be sure that I'm getting it right. But that's always the case with novels anyway. You must always operate from a position of humility, that you're trying to imagine somebody. You're trying to put a shape on their life. And if you don't concentrate now really hard, you'll get a detail wrong. And that doesn't matter whether it's a man or a woman. It matters that you have to work, no matter what you're doing, on the sentences. But not just on the rhythms of the sentences, but not just on that, but on the details to make sure that they're emotionally accurate and they're needed in this particular place.
I'm reminded of Henry James, who said, for instance, about historical novels, that, they're rubbish because we can't really imagine ourselves into somebody else's conscience. And yet he was able to imagine himself into these extraordinary female protagonists.
Yeah, I mean, he said there was a fatal cheapness about the historical novel, but what interested him in the end was the idea of the American, that the young American woman being a new thing in the world, someone who didn't want rank, but wanted something spiritually satisfying from her life. And if you brought her to England or Europe, what could happen to her? His cousin, who was one of these women, died very young, and he spent 2 novels almost reconstructing her, bringing her in Portrait of a Lady into the very places she wanted to go, and then in The Wings of the Dove, bringing her again to Europe, so that he was almost involved in the reconstruction of an individual whom he'd lost, but also in the elaboration of an idea, which was a new idea in the novel. I mean, in other words, in the English novel up to James, women were put in a position where the only thing they really wanted was marriage, and the only thing they wanted from marriage was rank and security. James's women arrive with this new idea that what they want from their lives is something grander than that. And they don't merely want rank, they want some sense of that in coupling, they would soar beyond themselves. And of course, they're defeated. But James's drama of women is very interesting in that respect, because he does create something new in the novel with his female characters.
Thank you. We have a question from Juliana, who asks about your novel Brooklyn, which was adapted into a film. And so the question is, have you seen the film? What did you think of it? What was your involvement in the adaptation process?
I wrote a novel called Brooklyn, and it has been adapted for the screen by Nick Hornby. And I wanted Nick Hornby to do it because I thought he knew something I didn't know. And that turned out to be true. He knew how to write a screenplay. And he found the center story, the center romance story, and he dramatized that being very faithful to the novel. And what was amazing for me was, then I had no involvement in that. I handed it over to him. And I was very happy with what he did. But what was amazing was that they shot the parts of the film that are set in Ireland in the small town. They needed a small town. And they found that my small town, the town the novel is set in, was suitable for filming. And they made streets of my town look noir, look almost glamorous, look like stuff, almost Hollywood sets. No one had ever thought about them like that before. And I think there are 6,000 people in the town, and 3,000 people, I mean half the population, wanted to be extras in the film. And a lot of them were extras. I mean, for example, they packed the cathedral with extras from the town for the wedding scene. And so that all of that, I mean, seeing your own town being filmed in that way was sort of amazing. And seeing also, of course, scenes you've imagined being then put onto the screen is both unsettling and fascinating.
Another one of your books had previously been
the Blackwater Lightship.
But
this was this is a sort of bigger deal because it's a full. The other one was for television,
yes,
and this is for the screen, and it's opening in the English language in November. So I suppose it'll come. I mean, it'll come around probably before the end of the year.
Okay. There was a question which here it is. About legalization of gay marriage in Ireland. So I saw you give a talk just a couple of days before the referendum, and I mean this was firing up the entire country in a way that
I mean it was amazing. It was an amazing campaign because it had to be done by plebiscite. It had to be done by referendum because of the Irish Constitution. So the thing was, what you wanted people to do was to change their minds. And this is a very hard thing to get people to do. In other words, Ireland's a very small country. There are 2 million people going to vote. 500,000 were always going to vote no. 500,000 were always going to vote yes. There was 1 million in the middle, and we wanted them to vote yes for us. And we wanted to work out then what to say to them. And one of the things that began to say to them, just start telling them your own story. Don't start talking about abstract things like human rights or gay rights. Tell them your story and see what they have to say about that. But what started to happen, it was really funny, it was absolutely amazing. People started to come out. Now, the Minister for Health in Ireland is really handsome, he's half Indian, he's incredibly clever, he's a policy wonk. You know, he's like he's just completely involved in white papers and policy. He came on the radio one day and said, "I'm gay." "Oh, you're gay." The following week, the former Minister for Defence, he's in his 60s, who had never given any obvious sign of being gay before, came on the radio and said, "I'm gay too, and I have my first boyfriend." I said, "What?" And then the following week, this is during the campaign, the following week, Justin, who's the beautiful son of the former President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, Justin McAleese, 20 years old. I saw his photograph on the paper, a big photograph, Justin. I thought he'd won some sports competition. And then I looked and said, "Oh, no, he's gay too." And then the following week, a famous woman who reports on television said, "I've been a lesbian all my life, but I've never told anybody." And I thought in the end the whole country, one by one, was going to come out. Like the bishop, the archbishop, the Archbishop of Dublin, the Catholic Archbishop of Dublin was going to say, "I'm gay." And then the Protestant one was going to say, "Me too." And one by one, the country was going to be gay. But what happened was that people phoned their parents and their grandparents to say, "Could you do something for me? I'm gay, and could you please make sure that I'm equal in this country?" And the parents said, "Yes," and they went next door to say to the neighbors, "My daughter is gay, and you don't dream of voting against her." And it was the older generation just turned. I mean, the referendum had been 10 years ago, they would have voted no. Just this time round, with a sort of new language being used, a language about, that you didn't say you were gay in the end, you said, "I'm Irish. And would it be okay with everybody if I could live a life in Ireland as equally as you could? Would that be okay for you? And I'm not doing you any harm." Like, nobody wanted to destroy marriage. People wanted to embrace it, which is actually quite a conservative position. And slowly, one by one, people, the million in the middle, changed their minds. And it was the most marvellous occasion because the count was in Dublin Castle. Dublin Castle was the bastion of British rule in Ireland. It was where people were executed and imprisoned. It was where, in 1922, the flag was handed over, the British flag was taken down, and the Irish flag put up. And this time round, on a Saturday afternoon, for one day the sun came out in Dublin. And on a Saturday afternoon, the rainbow flag arrived in the yard of Dublin Castle where the count was going on. And every gay and lesbian person felt absolutely, we could go in there and be, like in the very center of our country's life. And, I mean, you had to get up on Monday morning and go back to work. But for that Saturday afternoon, something very new happened in Ireland.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The gist of the question here also, the person asking the question is impressed by the fact that 20 years ago it was illegal and now it isn't, so the speed of change, and I guess comparing to the Brazilian experience.
Yeah, that it came very fast, that the legalization was 1993, because the old British laws, there was about Oscar Wilde behind bars, they were still in place in Ireland until 1993. So it was the last thing we ever thought would happen in our lifetime. Yeah, the dream.
Of course, we're paying homage to Mário de Andrade. We're sitting in front of this massive portrait here, and somebody asks, have you read Macunaíma?
Yes, I read Macunaíma. Not only that, but there must be people here who saw an extraordinary theatre adaptation of Macunaíma in 1980 or 81 or 82. It was a huge production, and it came to Dublin. And I'm not making this up, but most of the actors were almost naked. And it was the winter in Dublin. Really, it was a big shock. They were so beautiful. And Macunaíma. And it was what was interesting for us, of course, was because Ireland has such a cauldron of folk tales, folk stories, mythology. Writers find it very difficult to graft modern systems of narrative onto older systems of storytelling. And we were fascinated by the ways in which this had happened in Macunaíma, that two systems had joined. And so, it really affected people, the theatre show did, because also the way in which people were using not only their bodies, but a sense of pure theatricality in telling this story. And it was, I don't remember who directed it, but it was an extraordinary, eye-opening moment for Brazilian culture in Ireland.
Speaking of plays, the adaptation of Testament of Mary will be launched in Brazil later this year. This is
it's been going. It was written originally for an actress, The Testament of Mary, and what I had to do was keep it shorter. And Meryl Streep has done the audio book. There's an audio version of it which she did, and Fiona Shaw did it in London and in New York. So slowly it's beginning to happen in various countries, and it's coming here directed by Ron Daniels. But the casting is not fully certain yet. But it is going to open in Brazil, and everything's in place for that.
Okay. Can I ask you about your first impressions of Brazil? This is something you discuss in the Elizabeth Bishop book. Your first trip to Brazil was in 1985. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I just got off the plane, and it was before all those machines we have now. So I hadn't booked a hotel or anything. So I got a bus into the city in the dawn, with everyone going to work in the morning, with the light coming up, and with the sheer glamour, busyness, excitement. It was also then when I started to walk around the city with a suitcase. It was before we put wheels on suitcases. It sounds like the 19th century, but I was carrying a suitcase, trying to find a hotel. Now, it was fine in Rio. When I did this in Sao Paulo, and I went to the street, I liked the street. It looked like an old-fashioned street. The hotels looked cheap. I went from hotel to hotel to hotel, saying, could I have a room? And all said no. And they were very suspicious of me. I realized they were all one-hour hotels. and the idea of this Irishman coming to say, can I, I'm going to stay for 2 weeks. 2 weeks? But in Rio, the problem I had was that my hotel was in a street which I thought was Candido Mendes, but it was Candido Mendes, and no taxi driver could ever understand. I had to show it to them where I was staying. But also, what was really extraordinary about Rio at that first visit was the race question, was the way in which black and white people walked in the street, and was the way in which the streets were so mixed in that way, and the energy of that was something that I hadn't witnessed before, and it was really impressive. And I did think that first morning coming in on the bus, but I'm really susceptible to beauty. I could live here. I could just settle down here tomorrow. And I kept looking at buildings I'd like to live in. Then it didn't happen.
This is a question from Danielle. It said, Mário de Andrade has been the subject of controversy recently due to his supposed alleged homosexuality. Should an author's backstory matter to our understanding of his work?
Oh, yes, I think, it's really quite a big issue who a writer is or how we're going to read a writer. Because every writer works in code. Writing is a form of code. And it is a way almost of encoding or decoding the self. And who the self is becomes very interesting once a body of work is in place. And I think if you think about any writer whose work you love, writers of the 19th century, just to know, for example, who George Eliot was, or to know, to find out as much as we can about Shakespeare, I think these things do enrich our reading of the work. But in the particular case of gay writers, of someone who didn't let their sexuality be known in their lifetime, it allows the reader a way to look at the work again, and to look at the work, at all work by everybody, is a set of masks. But to look at the way this writer used masks and code. And so I think it is, it isn't, of course, the only way you read a writer's work. I mean, that would be deforming and a way of diminishing the whole idea of artistry. But I think when you read Henry James's novels, and you realize that so many of them are about secrecy, something not known that, if known, would be explosive. And you realize that this bothered him because of his own secret homosexuality. But it wasn't the only reason it bothered him, but it was one of the reasons. So I think it is something that we can't just say, oh, it doesn't matter at all. Of course the self matters. And of course sexuality is one of the things that matters to the self. So of course it matters.
Thank you, Colm. I'd like to end with one question, a request rather, for you to tell us what you mean in a line in this book when you write, novels and stories only come for me when an idea, a memory, or an image move into rhythm. What do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, if somebody comes up to you and tells you, I've got a great idea for a novel for you to write, which really does happen quite a lot. People think they know what you should do. And it's very difficult to handle because writing comes from so much from the intimate spaces within the self, from the sort of DNA that nobody will ever be able to get. And so what you have on one side of the brain, although I'm not sure about size of the brain, but just say what you have stored within the memory or within your thinking self are memories, ideas, images, things. And one of them on a given day moves, almost like a baby moves to get born, but not exactly like that, but moves to becoming a sentence from this original state, this mass of being just an idea, having no sound to it, and moves into being a sentence. And a sentence has, of course, a melody. It's almost like a melody in a song, a line of a song. And you suddenly have a melody. And now you can work. But until it does that, it's in the realm of storage space. It's just storage space in your brain. But what's very strange is the oddness of it and the randomness of it, the seeming randomness of it, that it moves and becomes a sentence. This miracle thing we've made as humans, the sentence. And you write it down and you look at it. And what you've got to do now is work. You have it now. You've been given, the only inspiration you're going to get is this sentence. The rest of it is just going to be sitting on that hard chair, finishing the book. But it is a strange moment when you suddenly see it. I have the sentence. I have the melody. It's come. It's moved from its inert state into its dynamic state.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
O mestre.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.